We begin the discussion on an issue making headlines. A book has been released by a deeply controversial figure who was US President Donald Trump's national security advisor for 16 months. The man who guided him through some of the administration's more hawkish policies, John Bolton's tell-all, The Room Where It Happened, reveals the inner workings of the Trump administration and some expected ridicule of President Trump behind the scenes, as well as more serious claims of soliciting foreign leaders. The book has ruffled feathers on both the right and left, with the White House calling it a bunch of lies and accusing Bolton of disclosing classified information. So just how much of this book should we take in, and how much impact will it have in America and abroad? We connect with Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as the special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. We also speak with Tim Sherrock, an investigative journalist at The Nation, who is a commentator on US foreign policy and national security. So my first question to you, Dr. Bandow. The White House has obviously tried to block this book from hitting the shelves, but US District Judge Royce Lamberth denied that request. He did say, however, that the memoir likely jeopardized national security. President Trump, of course, says Bolton broke the law, but even Nancy Pelosi, who is no fan of President Trump, said that Bolton has put personal gain over national interest. What's your take?
Well, the First Amendment is very protective of free speech, and basically no judge is going to issue an order and prevent publication. You might be punished afterwards if you're found to have violated the law and it fits within the Constitution. But basically, it's very, very hard to get a judge to come out and say you can't publish something. And I think that's the way it should be. You don't want to allow these things to be barred by politicians. You know, the president is using national security, like many presidents have, to try to get rid of controversial and hostile commentary about himself. Nancy Pelosi is making, I think, a smarter point, which is that John Bolton should have testified in the impeachment hearings and not held these allegations for his book to make money. And that's a fair criticism, that if he was this concerned about the president, he should have made those concerns known back when he was serving the president, not afterwards, long after he'd been fired.
Well, this book has drawn criticism from both sides. And Mr. Sherrock, Bolton refused to testify earlier this year and is now dishing the dirt with this tell-all book. What does this tell you about Bolton's real motive, and to what extent do you think we should trust him?
Well, I think his motive is very clearly money, not honor or the importance of his country's security. If he had really felt that Trump had committed impeachable offenses, he should have been honest and testified before the House, before the impeachment hearings had happened. But he didn't want to. He wanted to save it all for his book. So, I mean, I think that's the profit motive right there. And, I think it reflects very poorly on him. As far as the book itself, I think it's just a very, very self-serving book, and I found it very disturbing to read. I especially think that his reporting on Korea was just filled with utter contempt for Korea, North and South. I mean, he ridicules basically the whole President Moon Jae-in's focus on peace and unification as just some long dream of the leftists of South Korea. Doesn't recognize that peace and unification is something that's very important to the Korean people of all political persuasions, and in fact, has been state policy in South Korea since 1972 under Park Chung-hee. So, he just brings this idea that, unification and peace was just some, nutty idea, just so Moon could, improve his political standing in South Korea. That's basically the way he treated it. And I think that's very sad. And I feel that he really owes an apology to the Korean people, and Trump owes an apology to the Korean people for inflicting this man on us.
Well, the book is full of, it does have a lot to say about the Korean Peninsula, and we'll get to that in a bit. But Mr. Shyrock, the book also alleges that President Trump solicited authoritarian leaders, and one that stood out in particular was him asking Chinese President Xi Jinping to help him with his re-election, as well as backing Xi's plans regarding detention camps for China's Muslim minority. And it's clear that Bolton didn't look too favourably on this, but he did let it happen, though, as did other officials. Isn't this rather troubling if it's true?
Well, yeah, I think it's very troubling, and I think, especially when he's been denouncing China recently and trying to make it look like he's, a big tough guy and holding China accountable. But, in terms of human rights violations, Trump could care less. All he cares about is himself and getting reelected. And that's part of the point of Bolton's book, I think, is that everything focused on this reelection. The only reason he was caring about his summits with Kim Jong-un was that might help him get reelected. And the only reason he likes his talks with any world leader is that he thinks it'll reflect well on him and help his reelection. So, I think all that is quite troubling. But of course, it's not very surprising. At the same time, I would say, Bolton in human rights, Bolton himself has never said anything about, the human rights situation in any country that's of strategic importance to the United States. And I really don't think he cares either.
And Dr. Bandau, by revealing these sort of anecdotes and by revealing Trump's weaknesses in foreign policy, such as him being unaware that Britain is a nuclear power, for instance, Bolton was really trying to make the president a laughingstock, and the book does undermine the competence of his leadership. What kind of weaknesses do you see in US foreign policy in light of Bolton's claims? And do you think countries like Russia and China are going to take the US seriously now?
Well, I think countries like Russia and China have known over the last 3 years what they were dealing with. It's quite obvious that they, the Europeans and others, have worked very hard to manipulate the president for their own purposes. His vanity, his lack of knowledge. Europeans talked about the importance of convincing him that the ideas were his, praising him. I don't think there's a lot new in what we've gotten from John Bolton. He has simply reinforced what we all knew. The challenge is having a president who basically doesn't know much about the countries he's dealing with, someone who has gut reactions where for some reason he loves the Saudis and will do whatever the Saudis want. He hates the Iranians, so everything is focused against Iran, where there's no sense of argument, there's no sense of facts getting involved. He's really fallen in love with Kim Jong-un for some reason. He doesn't particularly like President Moon, the democratically elected leader of the American ally. These things are going to result in bad policies rather naturally, and unfortunately, we're paying for that. And you look at many of the issues we're dealing with, they've gone rather badly, and a lot of them could have been done so much better. You work with the Europeans to negotiate with China. You don't attack everyone at once. That's not the way the president does it. So Bolton has highlighted the problem. He hasn't really told us anything new.
And Dr. Bandau, John Bolton, in this book, he was obviously very disgruntled with President Trump's engagement with North Korean regime leader Kim Jong-un, and he didn't have much. He wasn't really a supporter of President Moon's peace drive on the Korean Peninsula either, in fact, calling it schizophrenic. Do you think Bolton had a role to play in the breakdown of the Hanoi summit?
Without question. Look, the problem is the president has some good ideas. One of his good ideas was engaging North Korea. It's hard to imagine how you solve the problem on the peninsula without talking to the North. But John Bolton had written an article advocating bombing North Korea before he took office. And he's actually did the same on Iran. You see the same kind of dynamic at work. So if your chief foreign policy advisor would much prefer to bomb the country you want to talk to, you can imagine how he can mess up the process. He can be in charge of the question of what options are out there. He can put out statements like the Libya model, knowing that the North Koreans will look at that. And what they think of course, is the killing of Muammar Gaddafi after he gave up his nuclear weapons. That is not something that encourages North Korea to negotiate. So I think that John is very calculating. He's somebody who I've known and dealt with some over the years. He's a very smart man. He knows what he wants. And he worked very hard to manipulate the president, too. There's no innocence here. I mean, no one should have any illusions that somehow John is kind of a pristine Vestal virgin in all of this. John knew exactly where he was getting into. He knew exactly what he was doing.
And Mr. Sharrock, John Bolton was obviously rather taking sides when it came to the South Korea and Japan dispute that we saw last year. Do you think that he had maybe a role to play in President Trump's sort of policies towards East Asia as well? I mean, especially when it comes to South Korea and Japan relations.
Well, I think he reflects the traditional sort of imperial view that the United States takes toward Japan and South Korea, which is that, South Korea and Japan should be part of this joint, U.S. military alliance, no matter what happened in their history between Korea and Japan. That doesn't matter to him. But getting back to what Doug was talking about in terms of these negotiations with Kim Jong-un, I think Bolton bears direct responsibility for their failure. I mean, he prides himself in the fact that he talked President Trump out of the deal in Hanoi, which could have been a major breakthrough. It would not have been the total, denuclearization that Trump was seeking and that Secretary of State Pompeo was seeking. But, it was very clear. We all know from the coverage and from those of us, who were on top of it at the time, that, there was an offer made. Kim Jong-un said he would, dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear facility, a very large nuclear facility, and he wanted the sanctions imposed by the UN during the 2017 crisis lifted. So a partial lifting of sanctions in return for this, closing down this very large nuclear facility. And I think that could have been a very important interim agreement. It could have kept peace, and they could have kept negotiating, the fuller agreement that both the U.S. and North Korea said they wanted in the very beginning of their negotiations, which was to normalize relations and build and restore U.S. North Korean, or build from the beginning on new North Korean U.S. relationship. And he almost single-handedly destroyed any possibility of that. And he's very proud of it. And I think that's a very sad story. And I think Pompeo is too loyal to Trump to have made a difference in that situation. He wanted to do whatever Trump wanted to do. But Bolton had the power, and he was able to convince Trump this is a bad idea, not to do it, and they walked away. And I think that was a serious mistake. And again, I agree with Doug. This was one policy that Trump did right. It was the only way to resolve the deadlock was to talk directly to Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership, and Trump recognized that. That's a good thing. And a lot of people here, a lot of Democrats and liberals don't agree with that. But I agree with that. That was a good policy. But the sad fact is the U.S. was not willing to go halfway, and which is what Moon Jae-in and South Korea wanted to do, was to have step-by-step agreements. And I think that could have really moved things forward for both Koreas, and both Koreas could be doing much more, economic interchange right now.
So you see a very big
joint development.
missed opportunity there, and well, he is highly sarcastic about Korea Peninsula affairs in his book. And just before we go, Dr. Bandau, how big of an impact do you think this book will have on President Trump's re-election campaign? And how much of this book, how much attention do you think this book should really receive?
Well, the book deserves to be widely read, recognizing it's a self-interested account by somebody who went into the administration, I think, planning on writing a book, and somebody who wants to sell a lot of copies, so who's going to hype things. So we should accept that this is not a kind of an innocent recording for the history books. But I do think that Bolton is not giving us a lot new. It will reinforce opinions that are already out there. People on the president's side will write Bolton off and say he's a special pleader who misused his opportunity to be around the president, and there's some truth to that. And Democrats will look at him and say, this guy's a crazy warmonger, very destructive for a sensible foreign policy, and they're right. So I think come November, this is not going to be the center of anybody's decision to vote. It's simply adding to a growing understanding of Trump's problems. When the economy was good, there weren't disasters, he kind of skated along. This year has been a disaster for him with COVID, with the recent demonstrations over racial equality. Add to that problems on the international front, North Korea threatening nuclear tests and such. You know, it's going to be a bad year for the president, and this adds to it.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Tim Sherrock, an investigative journalist at The Nation. Thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
This is also where we wrap up the show. Thank you for watching.